Hello and welcome. I did want to acknowledge today that there was yet another mass shooting, and I don't have any words for us, but I know it's something we're all thinking about, and I did again want to acknowledge that. So welcome to Elders Climate Action's May National Call. My name is Mark Cook, and I am one of 3 co-chairs of ECA's Education Committee. Many of you already know that Clean Air Month is observed in May each year across the United States, sponsored by the American Lung Association since 1972, to educate people about the impact that clean air has on our lives. As much as we might want to take every single breath for granted, we can't just forget about this for a year starting June 1st. In fact, on May 31, you are encouraged to sign up for a panel discussion titled Connecting the Issues, Air Pollution, Climate Change, and Our Health. Today, I am grateful to introduce our speaker, Dr. Juan Aguilera, who is Director of Translational, Environmental, and Climate Health at Stanford University, speaking on the intersecting health catastrophes of climate change and air pollution. Dr. Aguilera is also an allergy and asthma research scientist who studies the impacts of climate change, wildfire, and traffic-related air pollution on the immune and cardiorespiratory health of children, pregnant women, and firefighter cohorts. Previously, Dr. Aguilera has presented to our NorCal chapter, and we thank Sheila from NorCal for recommending him. To our audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom middle of your screen, and we'll get to those following his remarks. Dr. Aguilera, on behalf of our ECA community, thanks for giving so generously of your time and the vital work you do. Please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to Elders Climate Action. Has been an amazing group to collaborate, and as I meet more people that are working towards the problems that we are dealing every day, and now with increasing catastrophes and the increasing awareness that we need to do something about climate change and the environmental exposures that we are dealing with, I think it's just amazing to see how many groups are coming together. And this is a wonderful opportunity to have like some open discussion and at the same time be able to learn a little bit more. I'm willing to share what I know, but I'm also willing to learn from everybody. I would love to hear from the audience if they have any questions, if they have any comments, and definitely together we can work towards finding solutions and finding collaboration opportunities and action that can take us towards improving the health of our communities and for our planet as well. So with that, I'll start sharing my screen. And Mark, could you confirm if you can see the presentation?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. So let me talk a little bit about the intersecting health catastrophes of climate change and air pollution. As Mark mentioned, I've been working as a research scientist and translational environmental and climate health at Stanford University, but also being blessed with the opportunity to serve as a council member at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and also be a mentor for the Climate Reality Leadership course. Also been active with other organizations such as Climate Health Now and the Medical Consortium for Climate Action. And I think it's very important that working together, meeting each other, we all have common goals, and we want to learn and improve the conditions that might lead us for address the changes that we're experimenting with climate change. Some of the slides that I'm going to be sharing here were first introduced to me by my experience working as a mentor for the Climate Leadership course, but I will also be using this opportunity to share a little bit about the work that I've done and the research that brought me here as I started to get more involved in environmental and air pollution studies. So first of all, to give a little bit of a background, climate change comes thanks to the solar radiation, which most of it is absorbed by the Earth. But as this energy is radiated and then sent back to space through the infrared waves, some of this radiation is trapped by the layers, where the increasing amount of carbon dioxide, it's gonna basically keep trapped this radiation, which is gonna be eventually leading to an increased temperature that we have been experienced over the last decades, as there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. We have started to notice that there are some important trends of increased temperature in our planet. And I mean, the sources of all of these greenhouse gases are everywhere. I mean, from the thawing permafrost to air transport and oil production to coal mining and industrial processes. We see it also as in the industrial agriculture and the landfills. All of these pollutants tend to contribute. And with increasing temperatures, we have started to see that also as there's increased temperatures. Usually we're gonna see more forest burnings, increased timing in the wildfire season, more burning of crops. And all of this is just starting to come up as an increasing spiral where all these green gases continue to be a huge source of pollution and are continuing to fuel at the increasing temperature we have been experimenting throughout the years. So the largest source of global warming right now, as far as pollution goes, is the burning of fossil fuels. And I mean, just measuring the billion metric tons of carbons, this has been increasing over time. And this is why it's so important to become aware that we need to start curbing this trend if we want to see any improvements in the core temperature that our planet is experiencing. I mean, when we look at the global surface temperature that has departed from the average, we can see that the increase in temperature has been growing with time. And for some reason, I'm not seeing the slide animate. So let me try go back and forth a little bit. That's funny. For some reason, the slide is not working, but for whoever's interested, I can share further update of this slide where you would see an increasing rise in the temperatures and an increasing trend that's showing that this average has been increasing, and we're already over half a degree that we've been experiencing every year. So apologies for that slide. But the other important thing to notice is that air pollution is contributing to the health. And I mean, recently World Health Organization did an assessment when the amount of deaths attributed to ambient air pollution, it is estimated to be about 8 million per year. And depending on the country you're living, this is more or less, given the conditions of air pollution exposure, and the current access to healthcare. But still, we are currently experiencing an increasing trend, and our country, it's actually having also increased number of deaths attributed to air pollution. So this is why it's very important to be aware that air pollution is just not a problem of people that are vulnerable or that are experiencing some diseases that might make them more susceptible to the effects of air pollutants. This has an increasing effect on everybody because very likely all of us experience air pollution in one way or another. For example, one of the things we see in the areas where there's a lot of like wildfires is that there's been record-breaking burning of acres in a world warmed by climate change. Because with the increasing temperature and also the increased drought seasons, we see that the areas are more dry. This is the same for the trees. There's less humidity. So whenever a wildfire occurs, the amount of areas that are burned are gonna be higher just because the fires are able to propagate towards more areas that are very dry. So we're already seeing an increasing wildfire season, both in timing and in the amount of areas that are burned. And with increasing temperatures, I mean, an assessment of the hottest years of record that have occurred since 2001, the hottest year ever measured, 2016, was also tied with 2020. So just noticing how many record-breaking years we've seen where every year it seems to be like, oh, we broke another record of temperature. Like this has been the hottest year ever or close to it. This has been an increasing trend for the last 20 years with uh, not good news in regard that we're not seeing any shifts in this amount of increase in temperature. So there is something to be aware of. And of course, with hotter years, we typically see more increased fires. For example, in California, more than 360 wildfires have been uh, occurring over the past years, and it's just alarming to see what are the effects, especially in the communities that are close to. But I think particularly in the Bay Area, it wasn't until September 2020 when this orange sky over the Bay Area bridges actually brought awareness to the people that were knowledgeable about wildfires, but never experienced it in a large region. So people from the Bay Area, from San Francisco to San Jose and here at Stanford got to see this big orange sky that basically was telling everybody like, hey, the effects of wildfire pollution are here. We need to start doing something about it because it's not a problem of communities that are close to forests, communities that are close to certain areas where air pollution is increasing. This is a problem that has been extending and it's going to continue to extend. Because when we typically look at how the smoke exposure is equivalent, some calculations have said that it's like actually having like 15 to 20 cigarettes per day. And wildfire has been increasing to residential and commercial areas. And even an assessment in California has shown that most counties in California have about 60 days or more of smoky days per year due to wildfires. And the problem is that even after 4 or 5 days of being exposed to bad air quality, measured, for example, with an air quality index, we're starting to see increasing heart attacks, increasing stroke, increasing asthma for certain ages, and there is just no safe distance. We can see that the plumes, for example, that can travel from some campfires from San Francisco, like those smoke areas and plumes will just reach areas that are not even close to where the wildfires are happening. So if we're not aware of what is happening in our region, we're gonna start to see these trends becoming more and more common. And this is where it's important to know, well, what are the effects of air pollution? What is this pollution causing to our bodies? I'm gonna spend a little bit time on this slide because I think this is very important to understand that when we're talking about the particles that are located within the air pollutants, in this case, we use measurements to label the size of the particles. We often refer to them as particulate matter, so PM. And then depending on the size of the particle, we're gonna classify them, for example, in PM10, PM2.5, if they're larger than 10 micrometers, 2.5 micrometers, just to give you an example of how small these particles can be. This is a comparison with beach sand and human hair, which are usually like between 50 and 90 micrometers. Dust and pollen are usually like 10 micrometers in size. Our red blood cells that are throughout our body are 7 micrometers wide. So the combustion particles and organic compounds that are considered PM2.5 are even smaller than that. What is going to happen as we breathe in these particles that are coming from air pollutants, combustion, and even wildfire smoke? Well, we used to just think about the short-term effects where we would see our eyes, nose, or throat get inflamed. We might experience some irritation at the upper respiratory body, coughing and sneezing, it's expected. The problem is that these particles are small enough to actually go into the lower respiratory tract, and actually they reach our cardiovascular system. They get into our blood, they interact with our circulation, and over there, they're gonna start leading to long-term effects. Aside from, for example, asthma or bronchitis and problems with our lung function, we're gonna start to see some damage that is gonna have increased mortality. We tend to see increases in high blood pressure, increases in stroke, increases in pathways that are linked to inflammation and oxidative stress, which basically mean that our bodies are dealing with these particles and they're reacting, trying to fight these particles off and get rid of them as they circulate throughout our body. So this is very important because this is not only something that is going to affect our respiratory system, it's going to go down to our circulation. And here at Stanford, we're starting to see some relationships even further down and look at our immune system and how our defenses are reacting to the exposure of these particles over time. And I mean, just to bring it into perspective, with the increased awareness that we got thanks to the pandemic of COVID-19, we started to see that, yes, it's important to take care and consider what are we breathing, what are the measures that we can take to protect ourselves. Just anecdotally, when doing wildfire research, we used to ask people if they were consider wearing masks or even N95 masks because of the exposure to smoke. And people were not even aware that those protective measures and barriers existed. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, now there's more access to face masks. There's more willingness to use them, not only because of the pandemic, but now to protect ourselves from even other sources of air pollution and infection. And the thing is, the areas that were having increased levels of air pollution, like nitrous dioxide and PM2.5, saw increases in the COVID-19 cases because it was theorized that these particles would actually bind into the viral particles as well, and they would travel together, actually reaching out to more people. Personally, I did a lot of research in the air pollution at the US-Mexico border. I'm originally from Mexico and a border city called Ciudad Juarez, which limits with El Paso in Texas. My first experience working there was just noticing how people were exposed while crossing the international bridges. Because usually to get from one city to another, I mean, the cities are so intertwined that you basically just cross a bridge and you're already in another country. However, to cross the bridge and go through customs, people idle in their cars for even up to 2 to 4 hours just to get across. And also people that are walking down to cross without a vehicle are also exposed to all the fumes and all the particle pollutions that are coming from all those cars. So we have seen that there's an increased source of pollution there. And I had the fortune to collaborate with an interdisciplinary team where from 2014 to 2020, we visited about 5,000 residents from low-income areas to assess their respiratory and cardiovascular health and map what are the conditions of their health outcomes and what is the relationship that they can have with markers of chronic diseases. In this sense, we were looking at the traffic volume that they were experiencing and also the amount of street layers and sources of pollution they had close to their homes to make a comparison and find out what were the areas where they would see increased rates of metabolic diseases and relate that to the causes of air pollution. Because we were really interested in metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome, we used it as a marker of chronic disease because it combines a lot of metabolic pathways. For example, someone that has obesity, which is measured by a large waist, insulin resistant, which would mean that they will have a high glucose level, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, which is a fat compound, or even low HDL cholesterol, which is what we know as the good cholesterol. Like if you have 3 out of these 5 markers that are not normal, then we don't talk about like a specific chronic disease. This is a syndrome because all of these are occurring together, and people have a higher risk of having like stroke, cardiovascular disease, or have even complications of type 2 diabetes or hypertension. In this regard, we were able to map out the communities that had a higher risk of metabolic syndrome. And we learned that, for example, those areas that were in marginalized communities in the outskirts of the city, that were closer to areas where there was more dust and air pollution, actually had increased rates of metabolic syndrome. And this is just a way also where we can look into how some areas are usually more affected because they're exposed to heavy traffic roads, they're exposed to larger sources of air pollution. And this becomes also, as we call, an environmental justice issue, that air pollution doesn't affect all the communities the same. There are communities that are closer to higher sources of pollution, and we could see that their effects for their health on the long term are going to be increased just because of these exposures continue to be, while they experiment other things as well, like for example not having access to healthy foods, not having access to areas where they can have more access to healthcare or even the resources to know more about their health or about the things that might actually be detrimental to their health in the future. Also, physical activity was something that caught our interest. And we did a study about physical activity and air pollution. And this was done at an elementary school, which was very close to a freeway. Just to give you a perspective, a group of engineers measured the air pollution within the school grounds and located monitors. This device that we see over here in the lower right corner, it's located within school grounds. And outside this fence, you can already see a gateway freeway that's basically within 300 feet from the school ground area. So this school is basically located within 500 feet of a major freeway. And with this in mind, we wanted to see if for children with asthma, it was affecting their ability to increase their physical activity. So we measured that. We measured the amount of time the children were spending doing physical activity while they were attending their elementary school, because there's always this conundrum with physical activity. We know it's important to be physically active, to do exercise. We know that it's going to decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome. We want people to exercise and to enjoy performing physical activity in the outdoor areas. But when there's pollution, then what's better, what's worse? You exercise while there's pollution and then increase your respiratory rate and then end up actually breathing more particles of pollution. We know that overall the effects of doing exercise overweight that. It's better to do exercise than no exercise. But then what happens for children with asthma that are doing exercise and then the pollution levels are high? So we did learn that in this regard, as the children were performing under areas that were having more high air pollution, they would spend less time performing physical activity. And not only that, if the air pollution was high, not only on the day of the measurement, but it was high 2 days, 3 days, even 4 days before that, we would still see an effect, because for children with asthma, it's not about them having a bad day with regards to air pollution, but having a bad week where the air pollution continues to be high. It's gonna affect their abilities to even perform their regular exercise activities. And this was just related to where they were attending the school. But what can we do about it? That's usually one of the questions we get asked. How can we do that beyond the larger changes where we always talk about policy change and working with government or recommendations that are going to be further up the chain of decision making? What we can do at the small level, it's try to be aware about the things we can do to improve the neighborhood air quality. One of the things we do favor, it's the use of physical barriers and green barriers, because the improved neighborhood air quality from planting more trees or having more fences that are being covered by green leaves are gonna intercept particulate matter, and they're gonna serve as a protective barrier that would allow these particles to not go into the areas. Also, the increased shade is going to decrease the temperature of the asphalt, which will also decrease the amount of air pollutants that is going to go into the atmosphere just because of these changes. So that is something that we can take action towards too. We can create physical barriers with more trees, with more shrubs, with more green leaves that are going to intercept that, and it's going to improve the air quality of the communities within a short amount of time. But also something we've seen here, it's, well, what happens with, for example, with the wildfires? How do we approach that? And something that has been heavily debated is the use of prescribed burning. They say sometimes you need to fight fire with fire. And in this regard, like the prescribed burn is where you basically burn an area of forest, so it actually serves as a barrier if a wildfire ever occurs. We often get asked, like, what's gonna happen? You're still burning and there's still emissions that are gonna go into the atmosphere and affect these communities. But the thing is, these are gonna be programmed. The communities get a heads up of when this is happening, and they are gonna be able to take measures in order to protect themselves. Here at Stanford, working with Dr. Mary Pernicki, she recently did a study about the impact of prescribed fires and cardiovascular health of children. And she was able to show that when comparing the cardiovascular health of children that were exposed to a regular wildfire compared to a prescribed burn fire, just because of the measures they were able to take, the effects were milder in the people that were exposed to the fire when it was prescribed, rather than a wildfire that just occurred within that community. So there are benefits of using prescribed burning in order to mitigate the larger effects we could experience towards dealing with higher wildfire events. And in this regard, also, we've been able to do some research in other types of communities. For example, we recently been working with pregnant women from Fresno, and we were really interested in what were the effects, not only for their offspring, but at the same time for them. What's going to happen with the increased amount of air pollution during pregnancy, and is when it's going to be the links for some of the markers. I know the title is a little bit difficult to understand. For myself, as I started doing this research, I wasn't even aware about the increased links in this regard that will go into the genetic changes. But basically what happens during pregnancy is that as the body of the mothers change, they're more susceptible to inflammation, and there are gonna be some chemicals that are produced to deal with that as the baby is growing. But with increased air pollution, and to give you an example, Fresno, it's an area that experiences a lot of air pollution throughout the years. We tend to see that there's going to be an increased inflammatory state that is just going to be happening because of this increased exposure. And then if you add air pollution on top of that, then we're expected to see larger health effects of air pollution that can be happening during pregnancy. And we were able to show that. We noticed that the specific chemicals that are associated with inflammation are highly expressed and are leading to changes at the genetic level that are gonna basically lead to larger inflammation, which is gonna produce more adverse health outcomes for the pregnant mothers. And then some of the other work that we're actually studying right now is what is the effect of air pollution and smoke exposure in communities that are really exposed to it. And one example is just working with firefighters. Firefighters are usually the first line that's helping us out during like a wildfire or even a regular fire. And all of the chemicals and pollutants that they're breathing in, it's leading towards detrimental health effects. Just to give a bit of perspective, the life expectancy of the firefighters is usually 10 years shorter than the average life expectancy. And we tend to see higher levels of cancer, higher levels of stroke, high levels of chronic disease. And I've been fortunate to work with people at Stanford, researchers like Eric Smith and Dr. Mary Pernicki, who've been working with these groups to know a little bit more about their chemical exposures, their wildfire exposures, and what does it mean for their immune health. Because if we were able to see the relationships at levels that are on the immune system, on the cardiovascular system, then we might be able to pick up signals that are going to tell us that participants and people that are exposed to wildfire smoke could be affected further down the line if the exposure continues to be the same. So with this, I would just like to say that it's important to know that climate change, it's considered a medical emergency. And then because of that, we need to be able to act, we need to be able to collaborate, and we need to be able to actually find ways to collaborate. I think this is something that needs to be addressed by everybody. And in this regard, I think we have the opportunity to learn more about each other, because at the end of the day, our world depends on it, and we're sharing this world together, and the things that are going to affect some communities on the long run are very likely going to affect everybody here. So I think it's very important to work together towards improving these conditions, and to just collaborate and fight towards a better planet. And using our choices and our voices, we can go towards that. So I would like to leave it at that, and I would like to open up the floor for questions. So thank you so much.
I guess I'll ask a question. Dr. Aguilera, excuse me for saying it that way, but since we have an audience, we had the shooting today, and we just kind of hear the same old stuff over and over again, and people don't really respond to it. And and you've talked a little bit about just collaboration. Mm-hmm. And I think one issue is that's frustrating for me, and for a lot of us, is that there's all this research going on, and yet it seems, we just are not getting enough people acting proportionate to the problem in terms of changes. And so I guess I'm wondering if the real question here is, if you see a way for this research to get sort of synthesized, and we talk about the science, but the vast majority of us are not scientists. How does this make an impact so that people realize we have to change? It's not simply planting trees and things like that our behaviors, what we refer to as our ways of life, have to change.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. It's a very difficult situation, and sadly, even like currently, this has a lot of political bias. And I noticed some organizations have been trying to talk more and more to people in Congress and to address this issue. About a year ago, I think through the Medical Consortium, we were able to get a chance to talk to staffers that were working directly with the senators to kind of like inform them about like where the science currently is about climate change, about the vast research that it's out there. I was able to address this to some of the staffers of Texas senators. And the staffers were very open to knowing about it. But also like they knew about what was going on, and they knew what were going to be the reactions of certain senators, just because they tend to favor more the political message rather than the things that we need to actually do to address the current conditions of climate change. It's sad to see, and it's alarming, because what's going to be next? I mean, if this continues to be just a political situation where one group says one thing and the other group just denies it, we're not going to get anywhere. I think we need to start being a little bit more empathic all across the political spectrum, and realize that this is something that needs to get out of the political scope and just be something addressed as a community, as something that we need. Uh, and I see an increase of interest. I see an increase in groups that are collaborating, in communities that are just using like their voices to kind of like say, this is important to us, this is something that we need to start working on, and we need to start maybe becoming a little bit more involved even at the political level. I would like to see eventually more leaders emerge from these types of groups that are eventually taking up the mantle and say, I'm gonna run for this position, I'm gonna run for this other position, and I'm gonna use this as part of my political campaign, just because we need people like that. We need to reach those high levels in order to continue to promote that, not just stay within our usual place where we say this is going to be up to the people in power. We need to rise to the occasion. We need to reach those heights, and I think that's going to be the next step. And I'm hopeful that through all these collaborations, people like that are going to start to emerge.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, all of a sudden we got a lot of questions, and I don't even know how they if I'm getting them in order necessarily. So I'm just going to hit on them. And so the first question is, do exposure effects last year's or even decades beyond exposure?
The exposures do last, but there's some good news in that regard. It has been shown that when you transfer to an area where you're exposed to high levels of air pollution, and then you start to go to an area where there's lower levels and you have better air quality conditions, some of the respiratory effects, for example, tend to reverse, like those measurements that look at your lung function through some breath testing, like spirometry. They've shown to see improvements if you go into areas where there's pollution. As far as the cardiovascular changes, I don't think it has been measured at to that point. However, it is expected that it will be the same, that with increased exposure to better conditions of air quality, your body will have time to heal a little bit and reduce some of the effects. And this is also comparable to some of the things we've seen also with people that smoke, where some of the effects have also improved over the years. So it's definitely worthwhile improving the air pollution conditions.
Yeah, I suppose if there's a place we can go where there is no air pollution, that's probably getting harder and harder to find. Another question, I had heard that other body systems are affected by the PM 2.5 particles. Is it true that reproductive systems in humans are also being affected? And if so, how?
So we're learning a lot about like how these particles do penetrate into the cardiovascular system. And since they're small enough to reach our circulation, they're bound to reach every other organ from our bodies. In this regard, when we talk about like the reproductive systems, the increase of particles will very likely increase our body's ability to cause inflammation. With increased inflammation and stress, there's usually changes in our ability to produce and control the hormones. So with the changes in the hormones, it's very likely to lead to some changes at the reproductive level. Also, as we've seen with some of the research that's been happening with pregnant women, These changes in the inflammation state could lead to adverse health outcomes in pregnant women. We've seen that, for example, early pregnancy, it's something that might happen when some of them are exposed to high levels of air pollution. So this is where some of the effects are bound to hit other systems as well. Not familiar with all the research related to also neurological systems, but there have been some articles published on the effects at the neurological level of increased PM2.5 exposure.
Okay, thanks. Actually, this sort of feeds into the prior question. It says, when looking at firefighters, can you control for the fact that their job is highly stressful and that might explain some of the increased rates of cancer, et cetera?
Yeah, we actually do some assessments that will measure the stress levels, their anxiety levels, and we consider also some of the conditions and the amount of like fires they're exposed to, how many of them they do per month, and we've been able to even get samples a day or two after they go to a large fire exposure. So we are controlling for those. I mean, stress, it does play a large role. I mean, they're actually working in an environment that it's actually very stressful. Other communities are also exposed to high levels of stress. For example, people working in hospitals, people working in rescue, and actually the law enforcement. And I think stress is part of the puzzle, but at the same time also the exposures we see in firefighters tend to be increased, not only because of the wildfire or fire exposure, but also thanks to their equipment, which is also sometimes just includes a vast amount of chemicals. There's a current research we're doing where we're looking at the amount of perfluorinated alkaloid chemicals they have as part of their gear, and how that might also be playing a role in their increased cancer rates and survival rates.
Okay, thank you. Another question. You had said that climate change is a medical emergency. I think that was one of your last slides, if not last. And it says, what is the professional medical community doing to shift so that it more and more acknowledges and acts like climate change is indeed a medical emergency? And I do seem to recall some doctor actually in the Northwest said the cause of death or something was medical, or I'm sorry, climate change related. So anyway, I'm curious about this also.
What I've seen is that there's more organizations that are composed of health professionals. Climate Health Now, it's an organization that the majority are from the medical field, and they have chapters all over California, and they're starting to extend to other states. And they work closely also with the medical consortium that it's actually looking into how they can create more awareness. So health professionals are aware about the detrimental health effects of climate change and how these things can be addressed. They were among the groups that actually organized Congress visit to talk with the staffers of the current Senate. So there was like an organized document that was put together with different bullet points that were concerning about the health effects that were caused by climate change, air pollution, and what was the research behind that would back up each statement, so they would also know that health professionals are behind that. There's been a further push to include some of this information as part of the medical curricula, so medical students would know about it and learn about it through their medical school formation. There's also increased workshops and opportunities for medical students to join fellowships related to climate change, to participate with groups that are doing research. Here at Stanford, there's a lot of opportunities for like medical students that come and work with the air pollution teams and the wildfire teams, just so they learn a little bit more about the exposures. So there seems to be an increasing trend towards that. Other than that, I think the research is getting there as well. And a lot of physicians and health professionals are more interested in doing their research and also learning more about it. Hopefully, we're gonna get to points where more people from these groups will also try to work out with other organizations and finally cross that professional barrier when it's just not up to physicians or up to engineers or up to politicians, but more interdisciplinary groups will start trying to come up with better solutions. It's been refreshing that, for example, here in California, I noticed that there's a lot of air management districts that actually are trying to deal with the effects of air pollution and how it affects communities that are vulnerable, and pushed for legislation that would actually hold back corporations to not do like drilling near some communities. So I think that's going to be the next step, starting to see how can we implement policy, or how can we come together towards influencing those changes.
Yeah, I hope that extends not just to physical health, but to emotional and mental health too, because that tends to get marginalized. Um, okay, I'm working my way down. Sorry. Okay, okay, what kinds of messaging can we who are not researchers or physicians do to help people realize the connection between climate change and the very negative health impacts you have described?
I think the best way to deliver a message is usually to talk about a personal perspective. I think we all have a special someone or ourselves that have experienced the effects of climate change or air pollution and how it's affected their health. I would say always let's start with that. Let's bring the conversation towards, okay, this has affected me this way. This is what I've seen. This is what I've noticed. I've seen the increase in temperature. I've seen the increasing um, symptoms for my nephew with asthma. I've seen how the increase in temperature it's actually costing me more on my bills for electricity. I've seen how this is affecting me or people that are close to me, and this is a powerful way to deliver a message to someone that wants to learn more. Aside from that, I would say let's be empathic on how we communicate, and also focus about the things we can do at the individual and community level. For example, some of the things that have been more common here with the increased wildfire exposure is that now people are more aware about, for example, are they gonna experience either to a prescribed burn, or they know that noticing that the sky it's a little bit darker because of the smoke, they might use an N95 mask or a cloth mask, or even invest in an air purifier where they can have a clean air room within their house, where they can enjoy a little bit more of a better air quality. Also be aware about, for example, some communities are having like shelters where they would enjoy cleaner air just because of that this could happen, whether there's like a wildfire effect. So there are things and there are steps we can take towards improving the air quality, aside from like planting trees and things we can do within our neighborhoods, like just becoming aware of the things we do, and like make sure like the areas that we usually live on are well ventilated. I mean, we talk a lot about air pollution and smoke exposure in the outdoors, but there's also indoor sources of air pollution, and sometimes we don't realize that the fumes that come from our kitchens, the fumes that come from like our gas stoves are also a source of air pollution. So definitely there's room to look into the indoor sources as well and try to improve them as much.
Okay. Um, yeah, I grabbed this other one because I think it affects a lot of the Southwest. It says, it asks, is there research related to exposure to particles as a combination with dust? I know of agricultural communities that have fire and smoke exposure combined with dust exposure resulting from drought. Is there a way to separate these exposures in the research, or is there just a combined effect? And I think we know that the Colorado is losing a lot of water. Here in Arizona, a lot of farmland or agricultural land is going to probably just go fallow, and that there's going to be a lot of dust. And I think that's true of California too. So yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting question about dust also.
Yeah, definitely. And fortunately, in that regard, the research usually looks at the exposure of the particles by size. So usually when we talk about dust particles, they're usually filtered out when we talk about coarse particles or PM10. So there's research that usually compares what are the effects of exposure to PM10, and then what is the exposure effects of PM2.5, which are the finer particles. Usually the larger particles, PM10, are going to include the dust. And we usually try to separate the effects. So we would see if it's either if there's, for example, an increased symptom of just when the PM2.5 is high, or is it when the PM10 is high, or does it happen when both of them are high? So that is a way where, for example, we can look at the difference between like the finer particles and the larger particles and see if the effects can be separated. And I think it's very important because yes, usually the dot particles and the larger particles are gonna mask the amount of respiratory effects we're gonna see. Likely, large particles are gonna affect the upper respiratory system, but then when we look at the fine particles and we look at it over time, as when we start to see those effects of the smaller particles getting into the cardiovascular system, and then later have cardiovascular effects of or chronic effects of inflammation, for example.
Okay. Um, yeah, this is about local issues, but maybe it can be extended because whatever's maybe happening in your neck of the woods would apply to other places in the country. But it says, what are some processes, especially planning processes on a local or regional level that the public can participate in and can raise climate change and air pollution as an issue to consider?
Yeah, so at the local and regional level, I think the first step is identifying if there's any group or organizations that are looking into the air quality of the area. This is like very different depending on where you're located or how big the community is. For example, I'm originally from El Paso, as I mentioned, and over there's a joint advisory committee, which has uh, members of government organizations from Mexico, from El Paso in Texas, and also from New Mexico in Las Cruces. And they come together every 2-3 months to discuss current air quality issues related to like permits, to areas with higher exposure to air pollution. And for me, it was just refreshing to see this like binational effort of people in power and policymakers to kind of like drive the air quality. But I was even more surprised when I came to California and noticed that there was like actually formal organizations with uh, air management districts that had people looking into permits, looking into legislation, and looking into how they could have council members from the community that would inform their board of directors what's happening at the community level and what are the issues that the community need to look into. So that it's a place to start. Like, find if there's any groups, if your community has like a local university, a college, very likely there is a researcher there looking into air pollution. uh, Usually a lot of people in the engineering department, civil engineering, measure amounts of air pollution, so those are usually your first contacts with people looking into air pollution. And if it's a smaller community, then there might not be even groups. There might not be anybody looking into those issues. And that we're okay. If you're interested, then getting together with members of the community and starting a small group who could collaborate with other groups that are interested as well. Like, I know, for example, the elder group here, I mean, it's been doing a great job, and they have groups working in very different communities, so that's a place to start. I mean, everybody here it's interested in improving the conditions of all our communities, and if there's something that we could do about it, like, feel free to reach out.
Okay. Well, thank you all for submitting questions. And I know I did not get to some, and I apologize for that. But in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. So I just want to say thanks again to Dr. Aguilera for making time for us. And Dr. Aguilera, please let us know if ECA can amplify your messaging in the future. We'd be honored to do that. To our audience, thank you for participating. While most of us don't like to ask for money, we hope you will consider donating if you are able to ECA's continuing work. As a reminder, you are encouraged to sign up to hear a panel discussion titled Connecting the Issues, Air Pollution, Climate Change, and Our Health, to be held May 31. For June, our next event is intergenerational. It has 2 interactive parts on June 8th and June 15th for achieving intergenerational actions for a fossil fuel-free future. That's all for today. Have a nice evening, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.